Okay. I'll just start off by saying a little bit about how I got into reporting on voter suppression, which is sort of the same way that I think a lot of people come into voter suppression work of all kinds, which is through some trauma. And my trauma was minor compared to what so many people have dealt with in terms of voting rights over the years. But it was an election in 1990 when I was very, very young, as you can imagine. And I was in North Carolina, my first job, and reporting on the Senate election with Harvey Gantt, the first African-American mayor of Charlotte, running against Jesse Helms, who perhaps you remember. And it was sort of the defining race for me as a young person politically. And I worked for Gantt. Eschewing journalistic ethics, and Gantt was leading in the polls all the way to election day. It was famous White Hands ad, one of the most infamous television ads ever run, that Jesse Helms ran at the last minute, just credited with this narrowly squeaking by. But what I saw in Durham, North Carolina on election night when I was reporting as a young reporter was hundreds of people standing in line in Durham, North Carolina, in African-American districts waiting to vote at 11 p.m. while the results were being announced. And so from there, I began looking into the history of voter suppression. And I felt in a certain way that, when I was reporting in 2018 on your race and on Stacey Abrams and the races in Texas and so many others, that I was almost seeing some deja vu. Completely different kinds of tactics now, adopted for the 21st century, unfortunately. But they robbed us of a Governor Gillum, they robbed us of a Governor Abrams, and that has a knock-on effect all the way down, as you very well know. So this has been a passion of mine for a long time. I've reported for The Nation, mostly for Rolling Stone, and now for The New Yorker as well, on these issues. And I do see, I think you'll see in my report, that I do see some reason for optimism. Obviously I think everybody here knows that what we've seen has been this kind of confluence of history. You got Barack Obama elected in 2008, and as a native North Carolinian, when he won North Carolina, and I was watching North Carolina closely because I'm from there, that's when it started. That's when all of a sudden we're moving toward much more progressive voting laws, and this was the case in many states. And then it was right back in the backlash, and voting rights was the central focus right from the start of the Tea Party movement in a certain way. And so after the 2010 elections, with so many states suddenly being taken over by Republican legislators, they had free game for a lot of the new Jim Crow stuff, which was accelerated, of course, by the Supreme Court decision to gut the Voting Rights Act in 2013, and immediately the floodgates opened. But I do think that, and I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are about this, but I feel like the attention that was given to voter suppression and voting rights in 2016 and 2018, and continues to be in between elections, is unprecedented since I've been in journalism, for sure. And I feel like there is a backlash to the backlash, and we're seeing. I saw a stat yesterday that in state legislatures this year so far, there have been almost 700 voting rights expansion bills, and less than 100 restrictions. We know the restrictions are concentrated in battleground states, particularly like yours, but there is definitely a movement in the other direction. And I think the other very encouraging thing is that we're seeing so many voting rights groups, both traditional groups like the NAACP doing much better targeted work in voter engagement on the ground, but also groups like Black Voters Matter, Advancement Project, And you saw the results of that even in Alabama in 2017. And I think we there saw some of the potential for what could happen. And of course, we've seen it in Georgia as well. Stacey Abrams fell just short, but hundreds of thousands of people have been registered in that state and continue to be. And so I do think that we're seeing some momentum swinging back in the other direction. A lot of that hinges on what happens in 2020, and we are going to be seeing, we're already seeing a lot more attention to voter purges happening, particularly in battleground states and presidential battlegrounds, and a lot of things that we don't pay as much attention to, like student voting. One of the things that Republicans have done in the last decade is just micro-target and micro-target and micro-target. You start with voter ID, gerrymandering, and you go down to, whether this campus has early voting or not. Whether Prairie View A&M in Texas in 2018, they had to fight to have early voting on their campus. So we've got a lot of those kinds of battles that are going on, along with the large redistricting battles and purges. And, I think that it's, 2020 is going to be a more even fight when it comes to voting rights. That's my hope.
Yeah.
So,
I hope the same. But we're going to have to hope and work for it in order to make that true. Thank you, Bob and Michael. And Lawrence, in his introduction, said that we were experts. Now, Bob is an expert. And to the extent that I have any expertise here, it is unwilling expertise in the subject matter, but am extremely appreciative, obviously, of the work of People for the American Way. Bob, your report helped to illuminate and I think make really plain to a lot of people the diversity of forms that voter suppression takes. If we were in the 1950s and 60s, water hoses and police barricades and a very obvious physical presence of intimidation.
Right.
And today it takes on much more subtle, but I think equally impactful form. To give you an example, in Florida, just picking out one of our laws, which is the signature mismatch law, where a voter will go in and affix their name in order to receive their ballot. And if the W in their name doesn't look like the W in their name from the one on file, a non-trained signature expert, use that word lightly, can determine that the signature doesn't match and therefore invalidate that individual's ballot. It gets worse because the University of Florida did a study that showed that of ballots that were invalidated over signature mismatch, that 8 out of 10 of them were either from young voters or voters of color in my state, which has really big impact when you consider that Florida is a 1% state. Barack Obama won the state twice by 1 point. Donald Trump won the state by 1 point. The last 4 Democratic nominees for governor all lost by 1 point, and in my case, we lost by 0.4%, 30,000 votes, in a state of 22 million people. The good news, I guess, about our race, even though I didn't get to win my transaction to become governor of the state of Florida, we came shy by about 32,000 votes. But in that same election cycle, an election that was supposed to produce about 6.1 million voters is what the estimates were if we would have kept pace with the increase every 4 years in a midterm. And presidential elections, Florida comes close to producing 9 million, a little over 9 million votes now. In that election, 8.5 million people came out to vote. We broke and shattered every record for midterm elections. The beauty in that number was 500,000 of those folks who we worked intently to turn out through VBM, Vote by Mail program, were people who were registered to vote in 2016 did not vote in the presidential election, but showed up to vote in the 2018 gubernatorial election. 2.5 million more people voted than were expected to vote. And black voters, for the first time in the history of our state, voted at their share of the population. They didn't do it in 08 and they didn't do it in 12. We passed a historic piece of legislation, we altered the Constitution of the state of Florida through the passage of Amendment 4. That was, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is the single largest enfranchisement of voters like in a generation, Amendment 4. And we'll get into where we stand on Amendment 4 now, but that was a really big and important accomplishment in that cycle. As we think about, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about this a little bit, but 2018, 2020, both really pivotal years when we think about the fight for redistricting and our need to ensure that you have a process in place where fair maps will be drawn. It baffles the mind, certainly for me, that a race that I lost by 32,000 votes, 86,000 votes not counted, and I'm over it. 32,000 votes, that a legislature could be so disproportionately Republican, as well as a Senate. Now, this is a state of 22 million people, 30,000 votes separated the two candidates for governor, yet as recent as 4 years ago, we had a supermajority Republican leadership, and we're just sort of beginning to eat away at that. The good news about that as a result of our race was there were 7 legislative districts that I won that sent a Republican to the Florida legislature. If you look at the seats where we were within 1 point but lost, there were 8 additional seats that I lost by 1 point that sent Republicans back to the Florida legislature, and in every one of those seats, at a minimum, the Democrat was outspent 8-1. In one of those cases, it was 25-1. So going forward now, we're putting an emphasis, because in my opinion, all 15 of those become serious targets that we try to move into the Democratic column. And if we do that, right now we sit 14 seats away from taking the Florida House. If we do the work that is required, beginning by vetting a candidate in every single one of those seats, which we don't have a good habit of doing in Florida, that puts us in a position for, upon the decennial census, and as we prepare for the drawing of new maps, because our maps are still politically drawn, if you hold one house, you can at least force negotiation for the production of a map. And by the way, if the two houses can't agree, the courts will draw those maps. So it's imperative that we do the work that's required now to sort of move that forward. And as I just mentioned, the work that's required, following the race, I had to consider what's the highest and best contribution I could make coming in the aftermath of the election. I totally get why my 4 predecessors who were Democratic nominees and were unsuccessful go away and have great retirements by and large, because it is, it's a comfortable and an easier thing to do. And my grandmother used to have a saying, when you know better, you do better. Well, I know better, and having come so close, even though I won't be on the ballot in 2020, if a Democrat is ever going to have a chance again of flipping our state, particularly in non-presidential years, there's some work that we have to do to build back up our reservoir of voters. When Obama was on the ballot in 2008, Democrats outnumbered Republicans in registrations by almost 800,000, more registered Democrats than Republicans. After Obama's 2008 election, the Republican majority kicked into gear, and they passed legislation to criminalize voter registration, which means before, you could sit on your church pew and pass the clipboard down and register as many voters as you want to, or stand outside of a store, or whatever. But because of the fraud in the system, of which is yet to be proven, certainly in the way that they describe it, they forced a law that said every single person, individual who registers voters or goes about the work of registering voters must register themselves with the state, receive an identification number. On every form that you collect, that identification number must be on there, and you have 72 hours to turn that form in, or you can be criminally prosecuted. To make the point,
is a tiny window.
Well, it's ridiculous. I could see if you were saying 72 hours if you are 3 days out from the deadline.
Sure. Yes,
but 72 hours writ large, turn the form in is
weeks in most places.
Absolutely,
right? Yeah.
Is not right. It's not fair. And to make sure that we understood the seriousness by which they meant this legislation, 3 black school teachers in Jefferson County who were members of the NAACP, but also their church had made a commitment to voter registration, were collecting voter registrations, got turned in, and the state attorney announced prosecution charges against those 3 women. Now, because of the public outcry, we were able to get the prosecutor to step back from that, but you understand the chilling effect. Mm-hmm. And as a result of it, you had groups that were known for VR work, including the League of Women Voters, who pulled out of the voter registration game. So fast forward, 800,000 more registrations than Republicans, to when I was on the ballot in 2018, that advantage shrank to around 200,000, right? A precipitous decline over that period of time.
Especially considering the demographics of the state.
And the growth of it, right? Absolutely. Yeah. So, those are some of the challenges that maybe to the average person, you look, oh, well, why wouldn't you have to register? Why wouldn't you have a number that's associated with it? Why, in my opinion, why would you erect these kinds of hurdles to everyday people simply doing the work of helping people access their constitutional right to vote? And there can only be one reason for that. And that is that the people in power are attempting to suppress the will of voters who may not agree with them politically, and they fear what the consequence of having those people in the process might mean to their power. It's about maintaining power. So the work that we're now engaged in after the election, in March of this year, I announced an effort using resources that I would raise as well as resources that we had left after the campaign to register and re-engage 1 million voters in advance of the 2020 presidential election in Florida. And when I say re-engage, we mean those voters who were registered to vote in 16, registered to vote in 18, and chose not to participate in the process. They fell out somewhere along the lines. It's our goal to get 500,000 more of those folks in the pipeline. And VBM is going to vote by mail is going to be an important and critical part of that. The other 500,000 is our intention, working with our partners on the ground, will be through a very vigorous registration effort. There are an estimated 4 million eligible unregistered folks in the state of Florida that are our target. Not all of them. We got real targets in that. And that doesn't include the 1.4 million returning citizens. Right. So if you were to add that to the pot, you got a potential landscape of 5.2 million people that we get to go after and try to register. So far we have done things like partner with a cell phone company to pull down every Puerto Rican area code that is getting high use in Florida. Because these are ripe targets. They're U.S. citizens. They're in the state of Florida, and all they have to do is complete the voter registration form, and we can bring those folks into the fold. Through the use of technology, targeted advertising and not hustling, but the app hustle, that opens up two-way communication between the organizations that we're working with and the voters that we're targeting, the prospective voters that we're targeting, and partnering with labor unions and others in a really, really aggressive effort to engage and register Democrats in the state of Florida, and again in a state that is won and lost in the margins by 1 percentage point, roughly 100,000 votes. We feel like if we can add to our target list, 1 million new voters. And by the way, if we fall short and only get 250,000, that still gives us enough of a cushion to deliver a win. Now, the Republicans are all hip to the game. Mm-hmm. They know exactly what we are after and what our intention is, and they are working rather feverishly to throw up roadblocks at every turn. One example is I got a letter after we made the announcement that we were going to engage in this effort, and in part using money from my political committee, I got an unsolicited advisory opinion from the state of Florida telling me that I could not use any political money for the purposes of voter registration, according to their reading of the law, the state law. So we were like, okay, we'll open a C3 and we'll go raise other money toward the purpose of completing this mission. And the tricks continue. But Florida is a pivotal state. It is a state that Donald Trump knows can single-handedly deny him a second term. There is no pathway to the White House for Donald Trump that doesn't include Florida. So his campaign manager, who runs the national campaign, lives in Florida now, relocated. Their national Hispanic outreach effort is being run out of Florida. And to boot, Donald Trump is now a Florida resident. Yeah, well, thank you. I think the governor here said, well, he didn't pay taxes here anyway, so no loss to the state of New York.
No.
But those are, that's just a little brief inlet into some of what we are confronting as we think about what it takes to, frankly, finally flip, Florida. I think blue. I think we are a blue state. I certainly don't think we are a red state. I think we are an unorganized state. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to get organized, those investments have to begin now. I said to Tom Perez, the chairman of the Democratic Party, and his assembled finance committee, as they were talking about the 2020 strategy, that Florida didn't want to be a cheap date anymore. We don't want you to come in at the last minute throwing a bunch of cash around that doesn't allow us to treat our voters with respect. Yeah. Doesn't allow us to go into communities a year out from an election and start talking about the needs of that community, so that when we speak to them about the need to vote, that we're speaking their language. How dare you go into a community saying that this is the most important election and Donald Trump is qualified for the job, and not recognize that for these folks, their lives were hell before Trump, they've been hell through him, and they don't have a hope or a vision for how they're going to come out of it. So you're going to have to bring them more than Donald Trump is unqualified for the office, right? So we're trying to, raise the resources to make those investments now. And I think if we do that, it will play dividends, not just to 2020, but beyond.
Because it does take a lot more than going election to election. I mean, Democrats did that for so long, and voting rights groups did it for so long. We'll start a registration drive next year. We're talking about it now, and that's one of the encouraging things, I think, and that's one of the things that I think Stacey Abrams helped to. That's right. Helped to change.
Yeah, if I were smarter, I would have done what Stacey did, which was build your electorate first. Mm-hmm. It could have made a difference in the outcome of the election, but she was right. She diagnosed the problem, really early on. And in my case, I took for granted that we had a party that was doing the work of building a party. And then when I had the opportunity to look into the numbers, over a 2-year period, Democrats had registered 37,000 people, 4 million eligible.
Wow.
You can do that in your sleep. And so, not real intention behind that, so we've got to change that.
A lot of this work now, which I think is encouraging, is not done just through the Democratic Party. It's not done just through those traditional means. So, and I'm sure you're in the middle of coordinating all kinds of voter groups at this point. Absolutely. Which didn't exist 5 years ago.
Part of the reason why it's hard for a lot of the groups to, particularly in a state like ours, but I would argue probably in any state, to get on a level of coordination is because the donor class kind of treats us like the Hunger Games. It's like they can't work together. Make the distinction between what your group is doing versus that one.
Right.
And it doesn't really incentivize people to work together. And so, frankly, the first 6 months after our announcement was getting folks in a room and trying to build trust.
Right.
And the way that I went about that is I said, well, we're going to go out and try to raise money to make this all possible. Our first contributions are going to be to you. And so without having raised a dollar first, we started cutting checks to groups on the ground so that they knew we were serious and sincere about a true partnership.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that actually the Obama campaign innovated in 2008, you know. And I was talking to Laverne earlier about her work in North Carolina.
Yes.
And you were there in 2016. And 2008, right?
Yes.
In 2008 first. And, you know, that was one of the first times that we saw that kind of coordinated campaign, including your group. And, you know, I think that did, you know, put a scare into the Republicans, but it also set a model going forward that wouldn't just be campaign-based or candidate-based.
The incentive in this work is almost always around a particular candidate, a specific campaign, and not always around the work of sort of the democracy part of it. One of the things that you called out in, I think in an interview in August, was that you predicted that Texas was on the way to a blue wave in 2020. You're trying to leapfrog Texas over Florida. I'm curious to know. I'm curious to know what was all of us paid attention to what happened in the Senate race, and we saw Georgia, and obviously Florida. What informs that prediction that Texas in 2020 could potentially, frankly, be a game changer? If Texas is a concern for Republicans, it's over.
Well, you know, it's two things mainly, and one of them is this, you know, is this greater effort in organizing on the ground. There are some groups in Texas that have been really great. We're called Move Texas, and several others, and they're learning how to target actual Democratic voters, or actual likely Democratic voters. The problem in Texas has always been that you have urban outposts, and then everything else, which is so sparsely populated and huge that it makes it really difficult to do voter engagement, but the internet makes that easier theoretically. So I think that's one of the factors. The other factor is just the move in the suburbs, and Texas now goes as the suburbs go. And in 2018, the Democrats swept the suburbs, basically, in every major city in Texas. So, you know, and Texas has, I lived in Texas for a while, I was the editor of the Texas Observer, so, and Texas has, I believe, 8 million of the voters you're talking about who are unregistered. And so you've got an incredible opportunity there. And, you know, but you're right, if Texas ends up being a worry in October, November 2020, Florida's probably not anymore.
That's right. I would love for that to be the case, by the way. So the prediction is on target. You know, some of the feedback that I got from some folks from California and elsewhere after the election was, well, why didn't Hispanics in Florida perform the same way as Hispanics out west perform? And sort of the response was obvious to me, but it was very interesting that I think there is a real lack of understanding around Florida's Latino community. It is far from a monolith, and the politics of it are incredibly tricky. It's probably one of the few states where international politics plays equal to, if not more powerful a role than sometimes what's going on right in your own community. By example, if you're going to talk to and persuade Venezuelans to support you in Doral, you better enter that room first, talking about the fact that Maduro is a murderous, extortionist, corrupt, dangerous authoritarian leader who should be deposed, right, from office. And after you say that, you can talk about affordable housing and sea level rise. The streets are flooding over. And I don't mean to diminish that experience, right? These are people, many of whom who have, or their family, have fled their homes, their homeland, because of what has happened in that country. I had a Latino roundtable about 2 weeks ago, and one of the gentlemen who was there was Venezuelan, and he said, you know, when I was growing up in Venezuela, It was a prosperous country where the American dream was alive and well. The version of an American dream was alive and well, and I'm sure that was true for him because he went on to then say, "Our servants shopped in Miami," and I was thinking as he was talking because he was giving actually a pretty eloquent, telling a pretty eloquent story about Venezuela and what Maduro has done. Except that, it went to the servant line. I was like, okay, we can't put that on video. I was like, man, this is such a powerful story, but that line. But the point being, if in Florida, you have to understand, the Cuban community, the Cuban vote, and the difference between where younger Cubans are versus their abuelas and abuelas.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand the Colombian community, which is the second highest Latino demographic in the state of Florida. Obviously, if you are advertising and you're trying to do persuasion work, you don't want to lift up Donald Trump throwing paper towels in ads in Miami because it's not necessarily what's going to resonate, but it makes sense in the I-4 corridor. So that those differences are really, really important, and that's a constituency that we have to work tremendously hard on because they can flip the outcome of these elections. Except for the fact right now they don't know or trust us very much. They don't like him very much either. But it's hard to get people to your side with he's bad, but you're not offering, an alternative.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, that's true. That's true generally of Latino voters, that people tend to, everybody wants them to be a block.
Yeah.
But it's not a population that's going to develop into, that kind of voting block necessarily, and it is going to reward people, and it's the same in Texas, that it's a very diverse community, and it's also the challenges in registering people.
That's right.
Are much harder. Both getting people to believe that it matters, they matter, but also getting them to finding people, and actually the obstacles are just terrible.
Yeah.
That's been the problem in Texas, but it's also been a problem in Florida. But it's, we were talking about Texas and Florida, and we talked about North Carolina earlier. I mean, this is one of the things that I think really jumps out to you, and you've been reporting on this for a long time, because the Republicans have been so smart about targeting places for voter suppression of all kinds. And you really look at, you can look at the places that have just this year introduced those, fewer than 100, thank God, bills in states. They're all battleground states, or potential battlegrounds like Arizona and Georgia. And I think, one of the reasons Texas is in somewhat better shape in a certain way than Florida is that Republicans haven't zeroed in on it in quite the same way on voting stuff, even though they've done plenty there for years. But do you think that, do you share my sense that there is a stronger undercurrent of understanding about this issue?
Yeah, without a doubt. We're constantly running into groups and folks who are either initiating efforts or funding efforts that are highlighting the impacts of voter suppression more and more. Part of the challenge we keep running into, certainly in our state, is that we may make ground either through a ballot initiative or through a court decision, and then the Republicans act very quickly to sort of take it right back. One example is we had to go to courts to get polling precincts on college campuses. The Republicans would not allow it. The courts forced it. And in this last legislative session, the Republicans passed a law that said if you have voting, if your each voting location on campus must have enough parking to accommodate folks coming in to vote. Now, they're in a college campus certainly in the state of Florida, that has adequate parking.
There was never.
And I would argue that there probably isn't a
There's not
campus
one anywhere.
in the country that has that. And so that the effort here was simply to nullify, yet again, what the courts had said, which is, okay, you can have them there, and now they put a new layer of restriction on it, saying, all right, well, every college campus must have enough parking to accommodate people coming in to vote. Well, the reason why we want them on college campuses is because it's a built-in audience, that people are there. We just want them to have the ability to vote, and parking has...
Sure, and as someone I think pointed out from the League of Women Voters also, who are the kids who don't have cars to drive off campus to vote, and who are the kids who have cars?
Sure.
Exactly. It really is, and it's a perfect example of, and the way you described it is exactly right. There's a step forward, but the Republicans have been unbelievably ingenious. Really?
Maniacal.
That would be another word.
We have a few minutes left, but wanted to maybe open it up for some Q&A, and also wanted to highlight, Svante, you missed your introduction before.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes. Who just last week got reelected with 77% of the vote.
78, but
we had for 90, but anyway. Voter suppression in Mexico was strong. But maybe just a few questions, and then we'll wrap it up. And if folks have things they want to bring up. I was going to ask basically implications for 2020. So lots of folks are doing a lot of things now. What can people do to highlight this issue and turn it into something that works in our favor, rather than turns people off and saying, well, my vote's not going to count, so why bother?
Well, I do think that there's a very serious argument to be made in this election, that if you don't vote this time, your vote's not going to count afterward in the same way. And that, this is, partly because we're going into, this is going to determine redistricting in the states. This is the election for the next 10 years of voting rights in this country. But I think the other thing people can do is get in touch with these groups who are doing this work on the ground, in battleground states especially. There are other opportunities, as like the one that you want to talk about what you did?
Well, I've been working just with individuals, but also with a group that just started at the very, very grassroots level called Team for MC. It's a bunch of people who were very interested in trying to do work in North Carolina. Some of whom had ties there, some of whom just really knew that that was a battleground state. And what we did was to try and work with the Democratic Party on the ground and to kind of straddle between party politics and also nonprofit groups, because they work differently and they have different goals. And we were somewhat taken aback that that the party groups really come at the last minute. They really come late, and you try as much as you may to get them on board early, but that's not what happens. And so it's the 501c3s and the C4s, the nonprofits that are really out there doing the work of the registration, of the community building, of the of making, just as you said, we don't want you to show up at the month before the election. We want you to be there and listening to what we need and working with what we need early enough for that to matter. And so it takes a little research and it takes a little work, but but you can find the groups that are doing that kind of work now or a year ago, because that's when it needs to be done. It needs to be done now and not in October.
You know, people who won't toot their own horn is a good example given what happened in Virginia. A lot of folks, shout out to everybody who's working in the Equal Rights Amendment as well, the 38th state. There are enough states now for the Equal Rights Amendment. But Michael would testify to the fact that while we are all celebrating in the win here, that was years of work and labor, in the making. And to win on the Republicans, maps, some of those had to be redrawn, but to win on their territory was pretty phenomenal. And I think, it's probably an example of our need to show a little bit of discipline and patience, that one cycle sometimes isn't enough to make the scale of change that we want to see. I certainly feel that way in my own state. As I said, it didn't work for me, but I have every belief that we're on the right trajectory. I don't know if there's something you want to add about the investments.
No, I think you're right, and Andrew was wonderful coming to Virginia, coming for the candidates. It was so great doing videos for all of them, and it was amazing it took a lot of work, particularly for some of the younger candidates who did not have networks, to just have something. I mean, we couldn't afford landslides, so someone won by 500 votes. I mean, the whole majority was decided last time by one vote being drawn out of a bowl.
That's right.
And one of our candidates beat the socks off the guy again who ran, and they didn't rely on a bowl this time. But it took long-term, consistent effort, and I often say, and Bob and whoever we were talking about North Carolina 25 years ago, we would have said, North Carolina was going to be the new blue state, all the people pouring in there, the businesses and diverse population and all that, and that has gone sadly the opposite way. It is hanging on by a thread in states where there's consistent effort, which is what y'all are talking about, and what you're trying to do in Florida is key, but we've got to be on it. We cannot just drop ship this, and because it's never gonna work.
Agree.
What is happening with Amendment 4 with the?
Well, I was hoping we would leave everyone on an optimistic
Oh,
note as we end. But so obviously the amendment passed by 65% of the people who went out and voted, which is pretty sizable in our state. It got more votes than the governor, got more votes than me. It got more votes than a lot of things that were on the ballot. And at the first opportunity the Republicans had when they reconvened, they passed a new law, statute, that said that in order to satisfy the conditions of your sentence, you would have to pay all fines, fees, court costs, restitution to be eligible to register to vote. And if you registered to vote and you had outstanding fines, fees, court costs, restitution, that you can be criminally prosecuted for having done so. That is currently the law as amended or as passed by the Florida legislature this last legislative session. If there is good news on this, it is that this case has gone. The groups came together. The groups that got behind this originally came together in a lawsuit in the federal courts, and Judge Walker, who rendered a pretty powerful opinion. It is worth a read because he's eloquent and brilliant, and it's the best slap I've ever seen to this legislature, and basically admonished them that they have to go back and change this. Just to give you a sense of how egregious it is the Florida legislature, in order to get on the ballot in Florida, every single word of the constitutional amendment must be approved by the sitting Supreme Court. Like fine tooth. I mean, I've seen them argue over some of the most innocuous things. And nowhere in that language did it say fines, fees, court costs, restitution. In fact, fines and fees and court costs are technically not a condition of your sentencing. And court costs are also paid through ad valorem taxes in Florida. Now, my taxes come out and I pay the county court system, and we pay for those costs. So the fact that that is now, the Republicans have done what they've done. The good news is the opinion has come. We will watch and see and agitate when the legislature comes back into session, but I'm hopeful and optimistic that we'll be in a better posture, and that a good, if not all, of these individuals will be in a position to vote in the 2020 election.
Well, you did give us an
I
opportunity.
usually get and even more optimistic, yes. And I know there are people taking trains and planes tonight, so we want to wrap it up, but want to make sure that you all take a report. You're the first people to let your hands on this wonderful report. And we look forward to building on this and the momentum going into 2020. I just wanted to thank you all. I want to thank the wonderful Claire for making all this possible, and Lawrence and Elise for their lovely opening up. So thank you very much.